First of all, let's welcome all of you in this talk called Recreating an iOS Zero-Day Jailbreak out of Apple's Security Patches. First of all, I'm happy to be here, I believe the third or fourth time at this conference. And this time I want to take you through the journey of looking at Apple's security fixes and seeing what was actually fixed and how this can then be exploited. So as I said, I can skip my introduction. Basically, I'm doing iOS since 2010, so it's really a long time, like nearly 10 years soon. So the motivation of this talk was that in February or beginning of February, Apple released a security update for iOS. This was 12.1.4, and then there was suddenly a tweet from Google saying, oh, by the way, this fixed 2 security vulnerabilities that were exploited in the wild. And after that, there was complete radio silence from Apple or from Google about this. There was nothing. Now we have nearly 8 months since then. Yeah, nearly 8 months, and we heard absolutely nothing. And so third parties like myself, we got into the idea, let's look what actually was patched and try to reverse that, because there was no real information from the official sources. And that was the idea of this talk, just tell the world what really, or what seemed to have happened. Of course, Google has their own ways, and for whatever reason, INB decided yesterday to release like 5 or 6 block entries in a row in the official Project Zero blog, where they describe 5 iOS exploitation changes they found in the wild, including this one that is described here, the zero-day one. So this basically means whatever we have reversed here, we could have just skipped that and just waited for Google to release it. But of course, in the future, we will see that third parties always will report bugs to Apple. And very often they don't actually do any write-up about these bugs at all. So we actually don't know how often it happens that third parties find something in the wild, report it to Apple, they fix it, and then just both keep silent about it. We don't know because Apple will not tell us. And as I said, most of the time there are no write-ups except maybe from Project Zero. So the agenda of this talk is basically a short introduction. Then I will go into how I diffed the kernel part of this. The next part will then be how third parties have diffed the userland part. After we found and located the vulnerabilities, I will then go over how we exploited the kernel part, or different ways you could do that. And then how the other third parties exploit the userland part. And in the end, of course, the short conclusion. So the introduction is mostly already given to you. Basically, there was this incident that there was this very serious FaceTime vulnerability where you could call someone and they didn't need to answer. You could auto-answer for them. So you could spy on people, and this was found by accident and got a lot of media attention. And then on the 7th of February 2019, Apple released this 12.1.4 security update that officially patched this vulnerability. However, in this security update, there were actually 4 vulnerabilities fixed. 2 were about FaceTime, and 2 were described like this here. And the issue I have with Apple description of these bugs is usually that they have a very rough idea where it's located. And then the impact is basically always gain elevated privileges. And they say nothing else, and that is a memory corruption. We can see here that there was a bunch of people who apparently reported this. So I don't know, for example, if this anonymous researcher is part of Google or why he's like listed separately here. Maybe several entities have found all the same 0 day. All the other people are basically from Google, but the anonymous researcher, we don't know. Okay. So the next thing that happened, I think it was a day later, there was suddenly the tweet from Ben Hawks, where he basically said, oh yeah, these 2 bugs were found in the wild. Of course, Apple has never told anybody about this, so this was the only information for a very long time that we had that something was going on. Right at this time was the Offensive conference in Germany. And this was a very big topic. Everybody was talking about this because there were so many unanswered questions like, how did Google find that? Who was actually attacked? Was it Google themselves? Was it one of their customers? There was no description what these vulnerabilities actually were. The only thing that was quite clear very fast from the description is that it was one kernel bug that is local and one sandbox escape that is also local. And so the question is, was this combined with some other remote capability, or was it just a local thing? So maybe someone uploaded an app to Google or somewhere else and they found it inside there. Also, we had no idea why they kept silent, because normally Google was always writing about whatever they did quite fast. And we also don't know if we ever get samples. The only other iOS 0 day that was found in the wild before was Pegasus from a few years ago. I believe until today, still there have never been released samples by those that have them. Yes, but as I told you, the situation has changed like yesterday evening or so. Basically, I learned about this like 2 hours ago. Google released this, what feels like 1,000 pages of information. And now I'm not even sure what of these questions is answered in this document because I haven't read it yet. So the only other info that we had earlier, which was from another tweet from another Google person, he basically said, oh yeah, we're just too busy to write it up. We're not trying to hide anything. Also, this was used remotely with an already fixed browser bug in combination. Yeah, so here are the references. Unfortunately, the last tweet, I couldn't find it when I made the slides. So for the last tweet, I don't have a reference. So for every section, I will provide a slide of references so you can always look at the actual thing, how it happened. Okay, this was the introduction. And now let's get into the real thing. So let's start with the kernel part. So when we look at the description from Apple, as usual, as I told you, there's very little information. The only thing that we learn is that it's a memory corruption, and Apple lists the component as IOKit. So IOKit is usually part of the iOS kernel, is one of the subsystems that basically is there to support device drivers. So you would assume in this case that there's some vulnerability in the main kernel. However, further analysis basically revealed that that's not the case because Apple used a very strange terminology to call this IOKit. So how do you start with this whole thing? Basically, you need to grab a copy of these patches. So you download these IPSW files from the Apple servers. The links for that you can find on things like the iPhone wiki. Those are just zip files. You unzip them. Then you use one of the public tools to extract the kernels from the wrapper files. For example, the tool from Xerob, which you can find on GitHub. And once you've done that, you can then load these kernels into basically any tool that deals with Mach-O files. However, IDA is the best because they support all the newest changes in the kernel layouts and so on. Also, IDA has this new feature called Lumina, which is basically a shared server across the world where functions get uploaded with their symbol. And so Lumina can detect already known functions in your binaries. And this means if anybody has ever uploaded an iOS kernel before, Lumina will give you this information. What you need to know here is that Apple made a big mistake when they released iOS 12 beta. They released one of the kernels that had 90,000 symbols in them. So they forgot to strip it before releasing it to the public. And someone immediately took this and uploaded it to Lumina. So that's why IDA is now so good in recognizing functions in iOS kernels. So the next thing, of course, you have to do whenever you do binary diffing, you have to clean up the disassemblies. So once you have done all of that, you can then start using a tool like Diophora, which seems to be at the moment really the only thing that is usable. It's open source. In the resources, you can find a link to it. So Diophora is nowadays used for everything. Diffing a whole kernel can take a night. So I just started in the evening, went to bed, and the next morning I looked at the result. And the problem here is we don't know where the actual location is. So we first tried just the main kernel, but we didn't really find anything. And then we took everything. The result is basically that we get a lot of functions that are not real functions that match with something else. So we get a lot of false matches. And the diffing result is also very incomplete because it's very hard to clean up a huge kernel with many drivers in it. So, but we were able to find one function that looked like this here. So this is the new version of the function after decompilation. And we could see that in the new version, there was suddenly a new size check inserted here with an error message that there's something wrong with the size. So we can also see here, we can also see here basically that this happens in an object called prof.info IOKit user client, and there's the term IOKit in it. So we matched our description from Apple where the vulnerability is. And yes, this whole thing comes from a driver called prof.info IOKit. So it's actually not in the main kernel, it's just in the driver. So when you analyze this driver, you will find that when you Google for it and so on, you will get no hits. Nowadays you find some write-ups, but before that you find no hits or no usable hits. You find sometimes a list of drivers, but no description what this actually does. So we had to dig a little bit deeper and find out what this actually is or how it can be used. So what we saw is that it's actually not allowed from most sandboxes to access this. There's only 3 sandbox profiles that actually make use of this driver, like Find My Device D, Mobile Activation D, and Identity Service D. So in theory, this means you would need a vulnerability in there to ever trigger this. Or a vulnerability outside of the sandbox, and this is that we will learn later what really happened. So the next thing when you analyze is that you will realize that this function that we found that is vulnerable, it is part of this object here that is called user clients. So user clients in IOKit are always the part that interfaces with userland. So this is what userland code actually talks to. So every driver that wants to talk with userland has to usually provide such an object. And one of the ways to talk to userland is via the so-called external methods, which is basically a list of methods that you make available to userland. And in total, there are 6 such methods in this driver. And we can see the names here. What we can also see is that in the binary, actually, these 3 have, for whatever reason, an obfuscated name. We only know their real name because there are error messages in there where the plaintext name is inside. The next thing is, this here was the vulnerability, the function that we found with the size check. So now knowing that these are all external methods, naturally I looked into the other 2. And I was very surprised to then see that the other, that 2 of the others, in total 3 functions, all had new size checks in there. So here's another length check in one of the other methods. And I will already mention to you here, this here is the very interesting thing. So basically we can see here that a mem move is executed, like a mem copy, and the length of the mem copy is coming from this here, which I can tell you is basically the incoming data from the user. So the user can basically in kernel and trigger a mem copy, and he controls the last argument, the length. So he can copy too much data. So, yes, and this is the other function that also has this problem. Here there are even 2 mem moves and 2 separate mem copies coming from the same input buffer. So this means we have in both of these functions a controlled mem move length. And this means we can have an arbitrary overwrite of data in the outgoing message. So this is how it will look like as a graphic. You have basically the incoming message, which is the call to the function. It has an input buffer. And then we specify how much we copy, and we basically copy it into the output buffer. And of course, the output buffer has only a specified length. And this here will basically take this data and trash the output buffer. Or not the output buffer, the thing behind the output buffer. So it's kind of like a buffer overflow with the source coming from behind our buffer. Okay, again, these are the references you need. So that was just like, what is the vulnerability in the kernel? So let's have a look at the userland part. So in userland, there's this company called SecOps who run what they call a reverse bug bounty. Not really sure what they really mean by that, but they released a write-up about this. It's linked in the references. And in the following section, I have a few content from their website. So some of the graphics I just copied over. So again, this time the bug is described like this. Again, it just has memory corruption and can gain evaluated privileges. And then it says it's in the foundation. So foundation is a hint that it could be in the foundation framework. Again, the analysis will show you that it's actually not in the foundation framework. So this time, if we want to actually diff the foundation framework, we have to deal with the fact that in iOS, all libraries and frameworks are in the so-called DIRT shared cache, which is basically a gigantic file, many hundred megabytes, where all the libraries and frameworks are inside, and they're basically paged into all processes at the same time. So the good thing is that IDA has very good support for this right now. Most other tools have really miserable support for this. So as long as you use IDA, everything is fine. Also, with a clear diffing target, the foundation framework, the diffing should go a lot faster. The reality is, when you do this on the foundation framework, you will find nothing. The reason for this is that once again, Apple has kind of tricked us a little bit because it's not the foundation framework that is changed. Instead, it's the core foundation framework. So if you intuitively try to diff this, you will get therefore a result that looks like this here. This here is one of those images that I've directly copied from the SecOps website. And here you can see that there's some very high likelihood this is like the matched function. And we can see that there are some changes in the function because they have a different number of basic blocks and so on. So you would have to look into what's going on there. So luckily the SecOps people already did that, so nobody had to really manually decompile this, because unfortunately this whole thing is in core foundation, and 4 years ago Apple decided to no longer give you source code for that. So we don't have source code for this, so it's harder to look at it. You have to actually really decompile it manually. So they did this and they came up with this here. This is also taken from their website. The function is super long and they basically have just marked here. So this here is a fix, this is a fix, here's a fix, and this is a fix. So long story short, what does it actually do? Basically, they identified that the vulnerability is a reference counting problem that leads to a double free. And it's basically in one of those XPC handling functions, and therefore it can be triggered via XPC. So that's really nice, because this daemon, a lot of entities in iOS can all talk to this daemon, and this daemon up to then was running outside on a sandbox and even as root. So this was a super target for sandbox escapes. So the vulnerability, to understand what this means, this, for example, is the dictionary that could trigger a crash. Basically, it runs through this CP preference messages array, and each element is copied into a separate buffer. And it's copying this without increasing the reference counter. So there's basically a pointer to it without a reference counter. And then, depending on the content, they call different callbacks. And these callbacks are then supposed to increase the reference counter on the object. However, when you have a special crafted message, you can call some illegal callbacks, so that will result in these reference counter never being increased. The result is then that we have one reference missing, and then on destruction, we basically have a double free. So the first one was the mem move, and in userland, we have a double free problem. Okay, so this here is the only resource I used. It's basically this blog post. Okay. Now that we've seen both the vulnerabilities that are involved, let's see how this can theoretically be exploited. So let's look at the kernel first, because the kernel is what I like most. Remember, this is how the vulnerability looks like in theory. So we can copy whatever is behind our in buffer and overwrite what's behind the out buffer. So the question that you always ask in this case is, where are these buffers? And I can tell you that the incoming buffer is basically coming from the middle of a mach message, because these external methods are called via mach messages, and then the buffer for the content is basically inside that payload of the mach message. That means somewhere in this allocated mach message, you will find your buffer. The next thing is, these kind of messages are used in a compressed form by the kernel and the userland part. So they try to make the messages as small as possible. So that means, depending on the length of the actual parameters, the message will be smaller or larger. So that means the position on the heap of the kernel depends on the length of the actual arguments to that function. So these are the two vulnerable functions that have this mem copy directly in the mem move directly in there. And we can see we have one time parameter length of 78 and one time of 8c. And the result of this is, because of this compression, that the upper method will use an input buffer that is somewhere on the kalog 4 kilobyte zone, and the lower will use the kalog 512 zone. So these are different zones, and if you're interested in this, you have to look into one of the previous heap talks that I did. Basically, these are different areas on the heap that is very nice, because then they can be attacked independently from each other. The fact that this whole thing is in kalog memory is also nice, because a lot of stuff, buffers and everything, is also in kalog memory. So you're basically surrounded by interesting things. And by choosing one of those different messages to attack, the attacker can kind of decide if he wants to go to the long zone or the short zone. I skimmed through the description from Ian Beer just an hour before the talk. So I believe the official exploit that was found in a while used this one here. So now what about the output buffer? Well, the output buffer is basically in the middle of the reply mach message. And this is initially allocated to be from the kalloc 8192 zone, because it doesn't know beforehand how long the output will be, and then later it gets compressed and so on. But this basically means that our outgoing thing is somewhere in this other kind of zone. The blocks are bigger in this zone. So the result of this is that our source and destination use completely different kalloc zones. That is nice because it means that an attacker can use heap feng shui on each of those zones separately, and they are not interfering with each other. The next thing is also that the attacker in the input can choose if he needs small or large zones, depending on what kind of attack he tries to do. By the way, this graphics here is supposed to show you that the in buffer is not at the beginning of this message, but somewhere in there. And the actual copy is also not at the very beginning, but somewhere here. And then all of this here is basically moved into the output buffer, but also not at the beginning of the output buffer, but a little bit in. I think in both cases, 4 bytes in. So, knowing this, now the question is, how can you exploit this? So I already told you, you basically need heap feng shui to exploit this. And most exploits against iOS kernel in the past few years use fake port techniques to somehow in the end get something called the kernel task port, which then legally gives you read-write access to the kernel from userland. This is usually what most of the iOS exploits do. So the heap feng shui techniques that we publicly know about is this here, that we have VMware copy T. That is the old one introduced around the time of iOS 6 from Mark Dowd and Tajay Mand. After that, up to iOS 9, most public jailbreak were using this technique. But with every new revision, Apple made it less and less and less useful. But in our case, the remaining things that you can do with this is still good enough for what we are trying to do with it. Then we have this second technique, which is the OLL ports descriptor technique. That was taught in my training for a long time, and then the first time it was public was around the time of Yalu, because they put it in there. And then in 2017, I did a talk at Kensec West describing this technique. It basically allows you to fill the memory with pointers to ports. So the third one is this OS unserialized XML and OS unserialized X binary. This is a technique for heap feng shui that I created around the time of iOS 5, long time ago. And then Apple patched it to mitigate my attacks. And later they unpatched it again. So basically, my original attacks from around of iOS 5 is still possible against these things. Also, some slight variants were always possible. So still a valid thing. Basically, these techniques allow you to spray the heap with C++ objects and their data in kernel land. Then the next technique is similar. It basically assumes that Apple fixed everything that I showed and combines it with a different driver, the iOS Surface driver. And this year was presented at this conference like 2 years ago, I believe, by Adam, I always forget, Donefeld or so. Please don't... I always forget this last name. So he basically showed how he combined this technique with his iOS Surface interface. And the nice thing about this technique and this technique is that you can not only overwrite stuff, but you can also read back to some degree what was overwritten with. So this can be used for info leaks. That's why these are interesting. So, and the last one that is mentioned here is something that Ian Beer invented. So he's basically spraying the memory with new ports that have pre-allocated mach messages. And this is something that was used, for example, in the extract recipe iOS 10 jailbreak. But as far as I remember, it's Ian Beer who did this first. So, Knowing all this, the question is now, how can we use that? So in old devices, before the iPhone 7, this situation is basically immediately game over. I showed that in Kensec West 2017. Basically, I showed this technique where basically any memory corruption in the kernel is instantly game over on these old devices. So how can we use this in this case? Well, we first have to use the VMMap copy T technique to allocate something here in the 512 area. So we have full control over the content here. So we can make it userland pointers. And then at the same time, we use this technique here to fill in this size here, everything to 0 pointers to ports. What happens now is when we trigger the vulnerability is that our control data from here is written into a port pointer here. So this here will be taken as a port pointer. So on the old devices before the iPhone 7, this is instant game over because we can make it a userland pointer. And because userland dereference is possible on these devices, you can do whatever you want in userland, change the port as much as you want, and you can use it then from userland. And in this Kensec West talk, I basically showed how you first fake a clock port this way. This allows you to break KSLR because you can brute force the kernel base address. Then you use task port with the pit for task method. This allows you to read arbitrary 32-bit values from kernel land. And then with the help of these reads, you can then create a new task port that is basically a kernel task port or a fake kernel task port. And this can then be used in VM read, VM write, and so on to read and write kernel memory. Again, if you want to figure out how this really works in detail, the Kensec West slides are there. Well, there's a reference so you can find it. So, but we are on new devices, so how would this work on new devices? The thing is, this bug is so nice that you can have many, many different ways to maybe abuse this. So this here is an example what you could do. In this case, it's just for info leaking. So you would use one of these two methods here basically to control the content here. Oh no, sorry, in the output buffer. So you control the output buffer here behind with one of those heap feng shui techniques. And then you trigger the bug. And what happens is everything that was in here will be written in here. And the nice thing about these two techniques here is that you can read back the content that is now in there, so you can basically see what you have overwritten this with. And this means any kind of pointer or whatever was in here is all leaked to you. At the same time, of course, you could have done a special heap feng shui here so that you know exactly what's inside there. But even if you don't do that, it's very likely that you find kernel pointers in there. Oops. Yeah. So another example is you could use the input zone, use the old technique again. So you basically control exactly what's inside here. And then this basically degrades the whole thing to a buffer overflow. And this basically makes it exactly the same as the iOS 10 jailbreak in terms of exploitation. So you could then take any iOS 10 jailbreak and combine that. For example, the technique used in extract recipe with Ian Beer's message overwriting, that is what you can do here directly. You can basically maybe just copy and paste it. Another thing that you can do is you could spray the input zone with actual pointers to legal ports, and then the output zone you spray with empty pointer lists. And what happens then is it copies the real pointers into the empty pointer list, and the result will be that when this here is all freed, all these pointers are basically, the ports are gone, and so we have a lot of dangling pointers to actual real ports. And in the past few years, there were multiple times where there were vulnerabilities with dangling port pointers. So again, you could use any of those exploitation technique that was used in these days. The last thing here that I have described here, I've never actually tried if this here is totally good. The idea is, because we are in k-alloc area, we can actually allocate memory and then make it next to other types of memory. INB has used this in its exploits many, many times. So the idea here would be that you flood the heap with new kernel ports, and then they are basically in this orange area here, actual real kernel ports. And then you can use this here to basically partially override the kernel ports from the beginning. This allows you to change the pointer where the port is going to, but it also allows you to change the type of the port, which basically then allows you to actually have, again, access to a port from userland. As long you only go after ports like this, all of this will also work on the newest devices because we don't involve any kind of ROP. We only do data-only attacks to basically create fake ports. So what methods the attackers really used, I'm not sure. Like I said, I did not read the gigantic blog post yet. I only went fast through it. So, but they also used some heap feng shui and some kind of override like this. So, again, these are all the references. Only the last one here is missing. I will make an updated slide deck available at some point where I put this link in. So now that we have looked at the kernel land, let's have a look at the user land. So the user land again was looked at from SecOps, and they again wrote a write-up about it. They released the POC code. And the problem with this is their POC code has no payload. It doesn't actually do what they describe in the text, and it doesn't actually work on iOS devices for sure, because they are doing things that will for sure freeze iOS devices. So maybe there's work on a Mac, but even then it is just a crash POC because they gave up at some point because they could not solve a problem. By the way, the heap spray that they're using is basically copy-pasted from Ian Beer's slide deck. So, for example, they're trying to spray 1 gigabyte of memory. Good luck trying that on an iPhone. You basically freeze the iPhone. So, what kind of vulnerability was this again? So we know it's a reference counting thing, and it happens in the same XPC request without any interruption by the user, so we have no control between the first and the second release. So how do you exploit this? Well, you have to raise this. You have to get a second connection to the XPC server and raise this. How do you get in between? Well, you need to increase the raise window. So first of all, how can you do fill memory? Well, you create a new XPC connection and you just send over an array with a lot of data in it. So this will do a lot of applications on the heap of the same daemon, just in a different thread. Yeah, so you could do that. Or you have to do it multiple. If you have multiple cores, you might have to do this multiple times because on multi-core systems, the allocation might end up on different areas of the heap if they're made from different threads. So that is the first part. So now the second part, how do you ensure that you can raise that, that window? the idea is that you can increase the time window because the first and the second free basically happen. The first free happens in here when it runs through the array and goes through all entries of the array. So naturally, you can here see when you make the array very, very, very long, then this here will loop longer, and you have a longer time to actually get an allocation in between. Because the actual second free will happen outside this function here. So just make this here very, very long. The first element becomes your double free, the other elements you legally deal with, and then you have a longer time between the first and the second free. So what do you fill memory with? And this is basically where the SecOps people basically gave up. They realized at this point that how you exploit this normally is done via this FRAC article from Nemo, so you can look it up. It's basically a popular technique, but it requires you to have access to the first 8 bytes, which is the ISA pointer, the type of the object. And then you also need to control the length of what you're allocating. So what the guys of SecOps tried was to use strings because they can make them arbitrarily long. And internally it uses strdub, so it's just a normal malloc of a specific size. And you can also do this many, many times, so they can basically heap spray with it. So they showed that they can do program counter control from this, or crash control. But the problem here is that that doesn't work in reality, because the pointers will normally have null bytes in them, and the strings will be truncated at null bytes. So the POC that they released can never actually work in real. And at this point, they just skip over it and they don't say what they're doing. So, how did it really work? Well, this is from this blog that was released yesterday. As I told you, I have not read this completely, but as you can see here, they have the same kind of XPC request here, but they use a very different kind of messages that they send. Again, they have the fully documented messages that the actual real exploits send on this blog post. So I'm not going to copy paste this here. So you basically can read it from there, what they really used. So the nice thing that I haven't mentioned yet is, while you do this exploitation, you can actually abuse the fact that this daemon is started via a launch daemon. Because it means every time you crash this, it will automatically respawn the next time you connect to the XPC service. So theoretically, if you crash it, you could just redo it. That just means if your heap feng shui didn't work as you wanted, you would crash it, and then you can try over and over again. The question is, and again, I have not read the whole thing, so I have no idea how Google really found all of this. So I don't know if the original exploit was so noisy that it has a lot of crash dumps, because this would make it easy for Google to actually notice this kind of thing. But yes, this would be possible. If your heap feng shui goes bonkers, you can just retry after the crash. Yes. What would you do the moment you have ROB? So the good thing is, at the moment, the DILChat cache is mapped into all processes at the same position. That means a local attacker can totally bypass ASLR in userland, because all the libraries, everything's at the same position. At least at the moment. So, this means that creating ROB programs is very easy, because you know where all these ROB gadgets are. You don't need an info leak to actually find this out first. So let's say we have solved this step and we can run whatever we want in CFprefs-D. What should we actually do? So one thing that they said, which is kind of amusing, is they said, oh, you can run the system function, or you can steal the task port like Brendan Esser did. So the thing is, you cannot run the system function because the system function requires a shell to exist on an iPhone, and on no normal iPhone that is not jailbroken, you will ever find a shell normally. So what you can only do here in this case would be to steal the task port and then remote control the task. There are two reference linked here, both from Brendan Esser, where he basically shows this in one of his exploits, where he basically, in the first, he basically steals the task port and remote controls it, like introduce no new code and so on. And in the second one, he actually created a little library to basically bypass an Apple mitigation and do the whole remote control again. So he has created a library basically to run code in other processes. However, the only thing that we need in our attack is basically we need someone to open a connection to that driver and give us that port so we can then send the external methods to that port. So in any case, we could create a ROP payload that just gives us the driver connection over. Or we can steal the task port, but then we have to inject code that creates the driver connection for us, and so it's just the same thing. The only difference is that the one of the things has actually good library. So again, these are the references, and I'm already through. So basically, what are my conclusions from this research? The thing is that both vulnerabilities were easily found by just using a little bit of diaphora and then reading the code that was basically changed. From my point of view, the kernel vulnerability was super easy to spot from the diff because it was just a size check and a memcopy afterwards. And also the code flow was easy to follow, so you could see that this came directly from the user. The user space vulnerability, on the other hand, in my point of view, is more work to find because you have to first use different ways to find it. And then the code involved is a lot more complex, and understanding that there's a reference counting issue is also not that easy. So my point of view, the kernel bug was very easy to find, the user space a little bit harder. But you must always remember, as a defender, that this kind of work is done by people every day. There are people who do nothing else in their job than to reverse patches and write exploits for whatever they find. So also you must understand, when you look at a target, the more often you look at the same target, you already know how this works. You know how the target works. You know the code flow. And then you can basically find the actual real cause way easier. Like, maybe the kernel thing was so much easier for me because I always look at the kernel. Maybe someone who looks in these daemons, he immediately saw what the problem is. So always keep in mind that there are people out there that actually get fully paid to just do what you do for fun. Yeah, and I don't believe that you can stop attackers for long when you release the patches, but don't do a write-up for 8 months. Everybody who needed to know this will have known about it for a long time. Basically, when I released my write-up for the kernel part, I got some direct messages on Twitter where people told me, oh, by the way, the userland path is in this daemon. If you want, just look into this. And then the SecOps write-up came up way later. So people already knew about all of this very early after the patch. So the other conclusion is that the actual exploit writing was also, in my point, way easier for the kernel than for the userland part. Especially in my point of view, because there's a lot of source code when it comes to iOS exploitation for kernel exploits. And there's way less public exploits when it comes to userland exploits. And so when it comes to kernel parts, you can often just copy and paste stuff. And when you look at public jailbreaks, you will actually see that you can very often see code blocks that are completely copied, for example, from IMB's slides or so, or from his POC exploit. So those guys use a lot of copy pasta, and that makes writing these exploits, of course, easier. If there is nothing to copy from, like the userland stuff, then of course stuff gets harder. So now the question is, where is the code? Well, the code will be uploaded within the next days on this GitHub. If I haven't uploaded it in a week, ping me until I do it. So the thing is, I will look at the Google part, and I will likely rewrite a few things because the Google parts have way better explanation of certain things. And so I will likely have a better exploit at the end of the week. So you can keep updated about the release by looking at our Twitter. And yeah, if you want, you can also sign up for our trainings. Yes. So, any question?
Do we have any questions from the floor to start us off?
Thanks for the talk. This isn't a technical question about the vulnerability, but you mentioned that due to the fact that the service restarts and it can be noisy during exploitation,
yes,
you suggested that maybe Google could detect that. These are iOS devices, so why or how do you think Google detects that?
Well, the thing is, access to the crash dumps is easily possible on non-jailbroken devices. There's a legal way for example, Xcode to get them, but there is like open source code that will also pull them down. So it's quite easy to, every time you connect your device to a Mac or whatever, you can download all of the crash dumps, and then you see that there is something going on there. So of course, if the attacker is smart and they succeed, they can delete it afterwards. But yeah, if you have a device where the exploit maybe failed and suddenly you see there like hundreds of crash down from CF press D, then you can see that there's something apparently wrong in there. Yeah. But as I said, I have not read the blog post. Maybe Google discloses what they did.
Any other questions in the room? No, I think we have some on the Slido questions in that case.
Oh.
Just answer the ones you would like to.
I wouldn't call it a cache. But of course, every iOS researcher keeps a few things private because if they don't, then their possibility to research goes away with the next thing. Yeah. Yeah. The next question: I can have Jailbreak now? No. Well, that is a question you have to ask Apple legal team. I don't think that these two things have anything in common. Apple has sued other companies before who try to virtualize parts of the Apple ecosystem. So it's just like normal that they would go after Corellium after a while. They have gone after companies that sell Hackintoshes and destroyed them. So you can guess what happens to Corellium. Well, it's these days a lot easier to get into iOS research, I believe. And I'm not teasing my trainings here. There's a lot of actual content that you can find, especially from Google Project Zero. Or the members of Google Project Zero. For example, I mentioned Brendan Esser before. Before he worked at Google, he had like tons and tons of blog posts about different things. And I think this is just like a starting point, and then you maybe find people referencing it, and you just Google for it, and then you find a lot of write-ups these days. It's a lot easier than a few years ago. Oh yeah, and don't buy the book Hacking iOS. That is totally outdated. Well, this is something that will happen on all platforms, not only in the Apple world. there's always the vendor increasing security, and then somewhere we're breaking it. The thing I believe is, and sometimes I'm surprised we have not reached this yet, is that stuff will get so hard and so expensive to break that we will see no public jailbreak ever again. But we are not there yet, obviously. But yes, Apple makes everything harder. Yeah. Yeah, this is just like, yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the floor before we wrap up? Oh.
Okay, that question from me about the Apple $1 million bug bounty. Will you participate? If so, why? Or if you won't, why not?
Well, let's say it like this. I was one of the originally invited people, and I've never sent anything to Apple that they would pay for. So far, I have not participated in it. Also, I'm signed up. Now they've changed all the rules, and we will see. Maybe I sent them something. The question is always how good their payouts really are, because you must always see the magic up to. And knowing how Apple worked on this in the past, because I have the background info from the first bug bounty, they had some really strange rules how they set how high certain payments are. That was never disclosed to the public. So we will see how good their payouts are, and if they really pay out, then why not?
Okay, a big thank you to Stefan for the talk, please.